I don't know if there's really too much to theorize. I'll go back, I'll have a look, because I've got all this footage and there's probably loads more to pick up on. And so he did. It's been a full 12 hours later, and now it's time to record the video. So hello everyone, I'm the Game Beaver, and welcome back to another theory video. Not only are we going to cover the DLC, we're going to be covering more of the lore in the overarching world of Little Nightmares. So one of the most interesting things about the DLC is where you start. It's on one floor up from Six's campaign, and in this you can see the janitor chase after a child and grab it. You can see what happens after you're grabbed. The janitor seems to have no malicious intent and just takes you back to where you came from, or where this child escaped. We still don't know how long before Six's campaign this takes place. The only real time frame we've got is the area where the eye turns kids into stone. At this point, there is no kids turned into stone, and when Six comes along, there's quite a lot. The only other conclusion we can come to is that this campaign doesn't take place before Six's, but at the same time. Because by the end, we see the runaway kid and Six both captured. And we didn't even feed Six the bread. And by that point, she'd already eaten the bread and the meat. If we are to assume the child who fed the bread to Six is the runaway kid, then the runaway kid's campaign takes place after he's already given Six the bread. But if it was a different child who gave Six bread, then there's a possibility that this took place before Six's campaign. Confusing, I know, but hopefully that made sense to you. Even though every time Six is captured, she's very rarely killed, if at all, it's only the chefs that seem to do it, and that's because they're cooking, and that's just what they're gonna do with something that's alive, you know, just shove it in an oven or shove it in the fish guts. And even then, you're not technically dead. When I was at EGX, I had a talk with one of the staff members there, on their booth, and they said early versions of the game depicted Six being broken in half. This apparently was too traumatic or too brutal, so they took it out of the game. So whether or not Six was intended to be killed on sight, or whether this was just a way to get the rating down to a 16 from an 18, it's still unclear. But all we know is that the janitor does not kill the kids he captures. So this is evidence that the janitor isn't a killer. In fact, the only other time we've seen him interact with kids is bringing them up to his workbench, wrapping them in paper, and then putting them onto a conveyor belt. And the kids he's doing this to seem limp and lifeless, as if they've already been killed or died. So it's possible to say that these are the kids that may have escaped and died along the way, and the janitor is just doing his job and tidying up. When he does catch a child that is alive, all he does is put it back. So this means that he only sends dead children off to the kitchen, and his role is just to control/recapture the children in the prison, as well as to look awesome with dad hat. But this raises an interesting question. There are a lot of body bags. We can't deny that. In Six's campaign, when she goes up the conveyor belt and lands off, and it's undisputable that these are the dead kids who have fallen off the same conveyor belt. And there's a lot of them. But as we know, unless there's loads and loads, like millions of dead kids, the huge buffet that the guests seem to eat cannot be made up of kids. You've got big slices of what seem to be gammon on there. And if you look at the concept art of them all, it seems to have huge trawler nets dragging behind it, which explains how they catch the fish. And as for the sausages, they could just be ground up children, as Six was kind enough to demonstrate for us. But for the big cuts of meat, as far as I'm aware, there doesn't seem to be any pigs or cows on board. So if the children don't make up the majority of the meals fed to the guests, then what are they eating? The previous guests. If we go to the Little Nightmare website, the description of the moor states that those who enter are never seen again, and one way or another, they leave. And this gets even more interesting when you put this together with some more evidence. Throughout the entire game, there's shoes strewn about everywhere, including one room which is just completely filled up with shoes that seem way too big to be kids' shoes, and in fact most of the kids we see don't even wear shoes. I think this is enough evidence to back up that the guests are killed, and their shoes and maybe clothes disposed of, hence the reason why the janitor's wearing a hat, just like the hats some of the guests wear when they enter. And if you go back to Six's campaign in the restaurant, for some reason there's a chef that just appears, who then begins to hack up something in one of the rooms. And if we go one level up, there's a hidden area that reveals a guest sleeping. The chef's only there for one reason: to kill and chop up the guests. But we'll get back onto that later on in the video, because you're about to go down the rabbit hole with that one. The next part of the DLC has you chase after this girl. I will name her the runaway girl, you know, to fit in with the theme. And I did mention in the video, I wonder what happened. Maybe they'll make another DLC from this character? But while I was editing the video, I realized something. She's dead. Yeah, very dead. After you follow her, only for a short while, you fall down a drain pipe. And then, not too long after that, you find a torch on the floor. The very same torch we saw the runaway girl holding earlier. Next to this torch is a trail, which could be ink or blood. It's usually the leeches that leave the ink trails. As we've seen under the bed, there is a leech there, and there's a huge pile of ink surrounding it. And if you follow that blood trail, or ink trail, it'll take you in between a wooden fence where there's a handprint, almost like a struggle. And as soon as you go through that gap, there's a leech there, and with it, the footsteps seem to end. Bad leech. Now this leads to two conclusions. Either the leeches eat the children whole, mind you, digested it pretty darn quick, or something happens to the children in the dark and they turn into leeches. I'm pretty sure it's probably going to be the leeches eat children, but you know, since this is a theory video, we can't cross anything out. So throughout this entire DLC, we don't even see a single gnome. In fact, I thought I saw one, but after going back and replaying it, I found out it was actually just a rat, so sod that. There is only one gnome sound effect, and that's when you're passing through a narrow pipe. And not long after that, that's when you get a glimpse of the rat. And if you don't actually look for it, you might think that's a gnome. So where are they? I deduct that they might be hiding from him because of his appearance. If we look at 6, she's wearing clothing that makes her appearance that of a gnome. The pointy head. Maybe they don't see color. Maybe they're progressive like that. Which might explain why they seem to have no problem helping 6.
God, please, no! No!
And if you look at the next chapter of the Runaway Kids campaign, it states that only by understanding the gnomes will he survive. I'm guessing that means him and the gnomes are going to work together? Maybe will there be more hugging parties? Or maybe we'll see the Runaway Kid don a different headdress? Probably not. As in the teaser picture, we can see he's got a beautiful head of hair anyway. Sticking with the gnomes for a second, is it just me, or does anybody else find that all the levers and switches appear to be a convenient child size / gnome size to operate? Either that or they're incredibly low to the ground. I'm getting the feeling that the Moor is operated by the gnomes. I'm placing my bets on the gnomes having a big part of how the Moor operates, and hopefully the next chapter that takes place in the engine room will finally shed some light on those gnomes. Those gnomes, so cute. But something far stranger was revealed in this DLC. The Runaway Kid didn't get hungry, not even once. So if the Runaway Kid is a child, this would lead us to believe that 6 is something different. Either that or he just doesn't get hungry. I've mentioned in previous theory videos about the paintings and how they point to a relationship. A lot of these paintings are reused throughout the Moor, except one. There was one painting I completely overlooked, and it lies in the restaurant. One of the few places where taking time to look at your surroundings isn't really an option. It's very easy to miss if you're not looking for it. And like I said, given the situation, and you've only got one thing on your mind. No, there's too many of them! And it's a painting of the Geisha and a little girl stood next to each other in exactly the same frame. At a glance, one might assume that it's just a little girl. And you'd probably be right. Not gonna lie. And if we let the footage play a little bit longer, there it is. There's no disputing that's our Geisha, mask and all. But the clue is just that. It's a girl. Who else do we know that's also a young girl? 6. And that's really the only bit of information we've got to tie her to this painting. The only bit of information that would stop this from being 6, as if she was a boy. And that's precisely what Tarsier Studios, the company behind the game, tried to do. Going back to one of the interviews I covered in the second theory video, I think it was, they spelled out in black and white that 6's gender was unspecified, in a question that didn't even bring up 6. Before this, 6 was referred to as a girl in her own description on their own website, and even in the very same interview, some details of her story will be explained by completing his adventure. The game's own developers have went out of their way to shroud Six's gender in mystery. And I personally think it's to stop us from connecting her to this picture in particular, as it's the only concrete evidence that would tie Six to the geisha. Alas, it saddens me to say that the granny had nothing to do with the hanging man, so that still remains a bit of a mystery. And of course, it still could have some relation to Six and possibly being the father. That's never been disproved yet, apart from in the comic. The comic kind of does, but it only hints to her being off of them all. Not that, you know, she could have left for some groceries or something and they could still have been her parents. And all hell broke loose. So for now, all Hanging Man theories are unaffected by this DLC. Now, let's get on to that beautiful granny. I guess you can call her the Grandma. Get it? Okay, I can't deny it. I actually took that from a commenter on one of my videos. It was just so good. Now, to me, the granny hasn't been trapped down here. It's quite plain to see she's been living here for quite some time. When you fall through a gap or a window in the wall, there's a weird dress just hanging on what appears to be a rooftop. And if you take a closer look later on at the granny, she seems to be wearing something rather similar to that sort of dress. So either she's grown a lot, or maybe she's been here her whole life and just wears the same dresses? And if you want to look even deeper into this, the first trailer for the DLC, it shows that same scene, except without the dress. I know, it just seems like a bit of an interesting little feature to add here. Everything is placed for a reason. There has to be some logical explanation why they place that there. In one particular room, you can see that much of the furniture is tied down, so that if it was submerged, it wouldn't float. And next to that room, yes, there's ladders, but there's also a huge hole in the wall to the right, which could be how she's been getting around this whole time. If she has been trapped down here, surely there wouldn't be a pipe system or holes big enough to let her through. That clean hole to the right of the wall should be much more visceral and rugged, as if she's forced her way through. And outside that room, there's a carpet. I don't know about you, but the fact that the door's locked as well, it seems like this is something you'd find outside an entrance to a house or even a flat. So this is definitely the granny's home of residence. The granny has an interesting method of killing. Drowning isn't something we've seen before in the Little Nightmares universe, but it's also very reminiscent of the mermaid people from Inside. In fact, a lot of this level is quite similar to that level. We'll not talk about that. Now, as of recording this, the granny hasn't been added to the character list on the website, and that usually gives a more in-detail description of said character. So whenever that surfaces on their website, there's gonna be a little bit more information about her. But right now, all we have to go on is that promotional picture they posted on Twitter showing the new 3 DLCs coming out. And in that description, it says that she's been abandoned and won't let anything go. So instead of seeing a scary creature who lives in this water realm, perhaps all she really needs is a hug. Aww. I managed to lure her quite close to the edge of the screen, and it looks like once she drags you underwater, she holds you tight in a warm embrace. It's fair to say that the granny takes drowning in love to a whole new level. Oh, that was a good one. So that got me wondering, what is she actually interested in? Throw a can or a shoe in the water and she doesn't even bother to investigate it. But a fish head or yourself, oh! Come here, dearie. Yum yum. I also came across this little weird glitch while testing out what the granny liked. Didn't really have anywhere else to put it. It's just pretty interesting. And that's another thing. She's being fed on fish heads and fish tails, which are usually known as scrap parts. Another clue as to how she's being treated by the lady, or the staff of this establishment. But there's something else at play here. There are more hints towards a peacefuler time, or how these monsters are possibly connected. The granny is described as abandoned, so it's safe to say that where she resides, there would also be other things left, abandoned or deliberately thrown away. There is a very strange wooden doll left atop one of the suitcases. It's very out of place and it looks like it was gently put atop of the suitcase, as if it holds significance to somebody. Its long limbs are not too dissimilar to the Hanging Man's. And if we believe for a moment that this is in fact a doll of him, I know it's hard, but just bear with me. it would kind of make sense. If at 1.6, the lady and the granny, as well as everyone else, were a much closer family. A doll of this nature wouldn't be uncommon, but for one reason or another, the father was locked away, 6 was chucked in a suitcase, and the granny abandoned, as well as the doll. A metaphor for a time long forgotten. The doll is even shown in the official trailer Little Nightmares released on their Twitter page, so it has to have some sort of importance. Now, the only other room I can think of that had these sorts of dolls was in 6's campaign, and the room was filled of figurines. During your game of hide and seek with the janitor, you stumble upon an area filled with tons of these dolls. At one point I thought the janitor was the one making them, but it would make far more sense if this were to be the granny. Grandmas are often associated with making things for their grandchildren, or family. Or at least, I mean, that's my experience. I don't want to pigeonhole every grandma out there. Sure, everyone else has got their fair share of knitted sweaters and stuff like that. I don't begrudge it, they're damn comfy. I'll take another one, thank you, Grandma. The sheer amount of toys and dolls in this room means that at one point or another, these children were taken care of. How else or why else would a literal prison make toys for child inmates? If we take a closer look at these dolls, you can see that many of them are in different stages of completion. Some have clothes, hair, and hats, but the majority are unfinished, some and most of them without hands. If the granny was abandoned, then she couldn't work on her toys anymore and left them in their various states of completion. And it's also fair to assume that the janitor made them. I mean, that's why they're in his campaign. I mean, what the hell do I know? Or maybe there's something else going on here. Maybe it's my complete lack of sleep or God knows what, but this thought came to mind. Be prepared, we're about to enter the rabbit hole, guys. You remember a while back I mentioned about the chefs lifting up their skin to scratch at what was underneath? Yeah, pretty gross. What if they are using the heads or body parts of those previous guests? We've already came to the conclusion they're the ones being chopped up. I mean, how else could you get big chunks of meat or cuts of meat out of tiny little children? If they were to be using the heads and other body parts of the guests, this would explain the janitor's abnormally long arms, which begs the question, what do they look like under the skin? We don't have to look far. There's one character that has his flesh falling off him, and that's the janitor. But he looks strangely smooth. Could that be his skull? If it is his skull, it doesn't have sockets for eyes, like a normal skull would. Or perhaps we've unwittingly discovered the answer already. They're all mannequins, just like the dolls we saw littering the mall. If the janitor was made out of dead bodies, it would completely make sense. When you chop off his arms as 6, there's not a single drop of blood, which you would imagine would be pouring out of arms if they'd just been severed, and yet not a single drop. So that means this wouldn't hurt. As much, anyway. So imagine, if you will, mannequins with dead body parts on top, controlled by the Geisha. The only person we see actually bleed, and bleed a fair amount, is the only person I don't believe is a puppet. And that's the Geisha herself. Geishas are known to entertain, whether that be by singing, dancing, or even some kind of show. Probably with dead corpses in this case, however. Geishas are taught various ways of entertaining guests, and it wouldn't be hard to believe that our Geisha, the lady, could do something like this with her magic powers. Now, to say that the Geisha controls the puppet isn't too out there. We've seen that if the Geisha gets close enough to 6, she can actually pick her up. But is a distance an issue? I guess the argument there could be that these puppets are inanimate objects and therefore require less of a presence to be around in order to control. But a 6 being something that thinks and is alive, maybe it takes a lot more effort to pick her up. So if we consider for one moment that the Geisha has an ability to interact and control objects around her, this would also explain why we see doors randomly slamming. Especially in the ladies' quarters where there doesn't seem to be any wind at all, and the door slams behind her. On the Little Nightmares website, under the ladies' quarter it reads, "If the Moor had a heart, it would have lived here." If we take that quote and translate that into pure biological terms, then without her, the Moor would die and maybe all of the other mannequins along with her. But hey, that's just a theory. A beaver theory! Thanks for watching. So if you've got any comments or even your own theories that might explain something that I didn't, leave them down in the comments below. I love reading them and just seeing what other kind of ideas we come up with. It's honestly the best part of making these videos, because it sure isn't the editing, because I've literally sat at a computer all day today. Oh god. But if you enjoyed this, guys, leave a like, and if by any chance you haven't seen me play Little Nightmares as well as its DLC, I'll put up links to both of them right now. Whoopah! Because I assure you they're far better than anybody else's out there. So, until the next DLC drops, or I think of new theories that could make a really cool video, I'll see you later. Bye-bye.